Hi, in this video we will discuss action research. In most academic research, including in the social sciences, there is a clear distinction between the researcher and the subjects they study. This makes sense for several reasons. For one thing, a researcher is rarely a very representative study subject. They know too much about the research project and probably the object of research as well, and their participation risks skewing the data. In the social sciences, it is also important for the researcher to be able to maintain a critical distance from the object of their study, and not get overly invested in it emotionally, which could affect their interpretation. Basically, just like self-experimentation in medicine, being a participant in your own study in social research raises a host of issues and is generally avoided. Except in some cases, the researcher may, and in fact needs to be, a study participant themselves. A prominent example is participant observation, a method widely used in ethnographic research whereby one obtains insights about a community of people by spending a considerable amount of time with that community and participating in its activities. This allows the researcher to learn things that they may have never uncovered if they had just approached the same people as a complete outsider with a questionnaire or a set of interview questions. Then there is autoethnography, a self-reflexive study of one's own experience, which may be useful when one represents a unique but important case or when accessing other study subjects is difficult, for example for ethical reasons. And most pertinently to this video, there is action research, where a researcher is also a practitioner in an organization who wants to improve their professional practices by studying and reflecting on them. As with most concepts in the social sciences, there are many, sometimes competing, definitions of action research. Here is one suggested by educational scientist Jim McKernan. Action research is a form of reflective problem solving which enables practitioners to better understand and solve pressing problems in social settings. Action research is particularly often used in the field of education, where teachers design various interventions and study activities in order to address various issues they are facing in the classroom, and then monitor and study the process of implementing these interventions. But action research is not limited to education, and has been used in various other fields such as healthcare, business, urban studies, and so on. The word action in action research refers to the fact that, rather than studying existing practices, one seeks to design and put into practice an actual intervention or activity in order to address a specific problem. For example, in a 2015 action research project by Jung and Suzuki, the authors designed a classroom activity that involved teams of international students at a Japanese university collaborating on a wiki. This was an effort to increase intercultural communication and collaboration at the university, but carrying out and analyzing the activity also helped the authors develop guidelines for implementing wiki-based classroom activities in a more engaging and meaningful way. Let us go over the key features of action research. First, as you have already gathered by now, action research is practical in nature. The action and the research are two sides of the same coin, and the researcher learns by doing, rather than by observing other people do, as would usually be the case in, say, a case study. Second, action research must tackle a real-life problem that practitioners are encountering in their professional context. For example, many educators have reported struggling to motivate students in science and technology programs to take an interest in subjects related to arts and humanities. An action research project could address this by designing an intervention that, for example, combines digital technology and art. A researcher in action research is usually a practitioner who has first-hand experience with the problem and a vested interest in solving it. A teacher, a health worker, a museum curator, an urban planner, and so on. Just like case studies, action research studies tend to be smaller in scope and prioritize depth over breadth. They are also usually exploratory in nature and start as open-ended projects rather than a detailed set of specific steps to follow. If you already know exactly what the solution is and how to put it in practice, then action research might not be the best approach to use. But if you seek to discover the possible solution and how to best go about implementing it, as well as to deepen your understanding of your own practice, it is an immensely useful approach. This leads us to another key feature of action research. It is cyclical and iterative in nature. Many details about the project will emerge gradually, rather than being clear from the outset. Action research also involves reflecting on one's own process and making changes, and this is often done in cycles, where future actions are decided upon based on reflecting on past actions. Importantly, action research should also be collaborative. Since the idea is to benefit an actual community or organization, it is a good idea to identify and involve other stakeholders, such as, in an educational context, fellow teachers and/or students and/or school administration. Without their active involvement, not just as action research subjects but as contributors to the action, the researcher risks producing something that no one knows about or is interested in, and that will not end up being used in their organization. Finally, action research needs to be self-reflective in nature. Conducting it is meant to further a practitioner's understanding of their own process as well as their place and role in broader practices at their institution or in their community. Various typologies exist of action research, but in this video I will only introduce one, proposed by education scientist Shirley Joy Grundy. Grundy's typology is based on what is the researcher's primary motivation and expectation in undertaking action research. In technical action research, the goal is to use an intervention to improve specific, often measurable outcomes. This is the most utilitarian type of action research. For example, maybe educators are concerned that their students' performance in reading tests has been below par and would like to improve it. They could create a book discussion club for students in an attempt to motivate them to read more and do it more critically, which could result in better academic performance. In practical action research, the concern is not only with solving the immediate problem at hand, but also with helping practitioners understand their own practices deeper and improve them. In the previous example, students' poor performance in reading tests could in part be due to teachers failing to motivate them or not asking the right questions. This is something that can be solved in the classroom without an additional extracurricular activity, provided that the teacher knows what they could be doing better and why they're doing things the way they're doing them. Or for a more topical example, many teachers in the past year have complained about the burnout caused by the extra stress, pressure, and additional work resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic. In order to understand what are the contributing factors to these issues and how teachers are coping with them, one could design an intervention in the form of, say, an anonymous online discussion board modeled after a self-help group. Lastly, Grundy wrote about emancipatory action research, which some other authors also call critical action research. This approach is different from the other two in that its concern is not with incremental improvements in, say, the teaching process, but rather with challenging the assumptions we have about this process to begin with. Rooted in critical theory, emancipatory action research mainly concerns itself with social justice, aiming to identify and challenge the power structures that lead to inequality, discrimination, and silencing in educational and organizational settings. In that, this approach is a form of activism as much as it is a form of research, since it advocates the interests of a group that is in some way underprivileged or discriminated against. For example, this approach could involve wheelchair users who study at a university organizing campus tours in order to highlight the various accessibility and usability issues in its architecture and planning. The process of carrying out action research comprises four main stages: planning, acting, observing, and reflecting. In the planning stage, the researcher and the participants discuss the problem and design the intervention, as well as the detailed research plan. Acting refers to implementing the intervention and collecting data about it. Observing involves analyzing the data collected and sharing it with participants. During the reflection phase, participants can make sense of their experience and see to what extent it fulfilled their expectations and contributed to solving the initial problem. Since action research is often a cyclical process, the reflection phase will often inform another round of planning where the intervention will be adjusted, the issues identified during its implementation will be addressed, and the action phase will be initiated once more, which will then be observed and reflected upon. A crucial component of action research is reflecting on the process itself. For example, discussions with participants during the planning phase may themselves become a source of data about different stakeholders' expectations and preferences, which the researcher will analyze alongside the data collected during the action phase. If you plan on starting an action research project, here are a few things to consider. First, it is important to clearly define the organization or community that you are studying. Is it your school, workplace, another institution you have connections to? Secondly, it is important to identify a real problem that the organization is facing. Not something made up for the sake of doing a research project, but something that practitioners in that organization would testify they are struggling with. This would also be a good time to reflect on your position in this organization. Are you mostly an outsider who wants to help? Then you may want to spend more time connecting with and discussing with people who are active in their organization and whose goals align with the project goals, and you might want to rely on such people to make the key decisions that are based on knowing the organization and the context. Or if you are, for example, a junior staff member, you might want to consider how to negotiate the power hierarchy in the organization, because taking on the role of a project leader unilaterally might lead to tensions. Equally important is identifying your stakeholders and considering whom to involve in the process. For example, if you are designing a teaching intervention, you might choose to involve your students or fellow teachers, or both. You will also need to consider to what extent you want to involve them. For example, they could help you generate ideas or actually implement them in practice, or act as fellow researchers who help with data collection and analysis. And as the picture is starting to take shape, it is also important to consider what your own contribution will be. For example, will you be a consultant who helps design the intervention and studies it, or a teacher who will actually implement it in practice? Let us briefly consider an example of how one might go about carrying out action research. Suppose the goal of the project is to improve students' motivation in history courses. You would start with the planning phase. This could involve meeting with history teachers at your organization, discussing the problem to make sure they also perceive it as a problem, and brainstorming for possible solutions. It is probably a good idea to record the meeting with the participants' consent so that it can later be transcribed and form part of your research data. Let us say during this session, one of the teachers suggests using history-themed video games to raise students' interest in the subject, and their colleagues find this to be a good idea. Then, over a period of time, you would, together with the other participants, design an intervention. What games do the students have to play, for how long, how to frame this activity, and what to follow it up with. In parallel, you would also work on designing your research project, considering, for example, what are the kinds of data you will be collecting and how to collect them. Action research mostly, but not always, relies on qualitative data, collecting through interviews, focus group discussions, observation, and document analysis, although other approaches such as questionnaires could be used to supplement it. Let's say in this case you decide to conduct observation and interview some of the participants. Then it is time to act. You will proceed with the intervention. Let's say the video games have been assigned as homework and will then be discussed in the classroom. In the meantime, in accordance with your research plan, you would be collecting data by observing the classroom activity and then interviewing some of the students. In the observation phase, you would analyze the preliminary data you have obtained. It is also important to share the data and the results with fellow teachers, as you want them to be as involved and invested in the process as you are. Finally, it is time for reflection. You might want to have another meeting with the teachers to reflect not only on the data you have collected, but also on their experience and whether it matched their expectations, and to discuss what could be done better, and so on. Then you could start designing a second intervention which takes into account what you have learned from the first one, which then completes the cycle and starts another one by bringing you back to the planning phase. I hope this example gives you a basic idea of how action research works in practice. That's it for now.